All right, so let me say hello to everyone. Welcome. I'm very glad to see so many people joining, and just a quick thought about the logistic. If you're new to our seminar series, if you have questions or anything, don't have to raise your hand. Just please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. Uh, Barton just told me that he's going to take questions as they come, and let me tell you a little bit about Barton. So. Uh, he's a PhD student on the job market this year from UNSW. And, he's a fantastically productive applied theorist. So I think in the past 4 years, Barton, you've written 2 single author papers and 5 co-authored ones. So that's an awesome output. And his work is at the interface between econ and computer science. So, when I looked at his papers, he has wonderful papers in econ, in games and economic behavior, social choice and welfare. But I've also been impressed by his conference publications in computer science, where he has a wonderful agenda with David Parks from Harvard. So um, I think he's already a very, very accomplished researcher, and it's a very big pleasure for us to host him. He's on the job market this year, so if you are out there, I've been told by secret sources that he doesn't have a very strong preference for Australia. So, have a look at him. And Barton, the floor is yours. 1 hour and 15 minutes. We're very excited to have you.
Great, thank you for the introduction. So today I'm going to present my paper called Feigning Politicians. So the starting point of this project is that turning a policy proposal into law requires effort. So a politician might introduce a piece of legislation, but whether it actually becomes law depends on the entire legislative process and its many checks and balances, and it's going to depend on the actions of different key players. And so a politician might need to engage in backdoor deals, maybe persuade key actors, or just take particular care when drafting legislation. However, in many cases, effort is a necessary but not sufficient condition for passing legislation into law, because even the most skilled politicians will sometimes fail to have their proposals accepted. And so this means that politicians have only a limited ability to influence policy, and it's going to have important consequences for politics and policy making more broadly. So one of the immediate implications of this is that if politicians have limited ability to influence policy, then their political accountability is also limited. A politician might openly endorse or propose legislation, but then privately put little effort towards getting the proposal passed. And because effort is not easily observed by voters, when a proposal fails, voters will be uncertain as to why. And they're going to struggle to hold politicians accountable for the policy outcomes that they achieve. In particular, a voter will have to ask themselves, when a proposal fails, did the proposal fail because the politician exerted too little effort? In which case I want to blame the politician themselves. Or did the proposal fail despite the politician's every effort? In which case I want to blame the broader legislative environment. Okay, and I shouldn't really be blaming the politician themselves. But of course, this leads to a perverse incentive for politicians. A politician who disagrees with a constituency might find it optimal to feign a policy agenda, meaning that she advocates for something that she will not actually help realize, okay? Because she knows that she's not going to be held fully accountable. So as you can probably guess from the title of this talk, this feigning behavior is going to be the focus of the paper. But before I get into the specifics of the paper, I want to talk through a motivating example where it's suggested that we actually saw this feigning behavior. So in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected as president of the United States. And in this election, one voter base in particular is considered to have been crucial. And this group was known as the Christian Right, which was a conservative political faction promoting Christian values. And because of their crucial position in getting Reagan elected, they demanded progress towards a divisive social agenda. But historical accounts actually suggest that Reagan was not really committed to this agenda. And so Young, a political scientist and journalist, describes how the Reagan administration dealt with the demands of the Christian right. And he says, small gestures could be extended, like proposing a bill or delivering a speech, but less effort would be done to see that such a bill would pass or that a speech's promises would actually be carried out. And so this is precisely the story that Reagan was taking public actions that are matching what the constituency wants, but then privately, when voters can't see, they're doing the opposite, they're actually trying to make these policies fail. And so this is precisely this feigning story. But of course, to some extent, this is only half the story because there's a policy outcome that gets realized and voters are going to see this. And so what happened is after a string of policy failures, the Christian right was left disappointed, of course, but it was unclear who or what was to be blamed. So in line with this idea that voters don't see effort, some directed blame towards legislative barriers beyond Reagan's control. And so the New York Times wrote, many Christian conservatives, rather than hold Reagan personally responsible, they blamed moderates for blocking their agenda. But of course, there's another camp which directed blame towards Reagan, suggesting that his actual lack of effort in him personally is responsible for the lack of policy successes. But in any case, regardless of who or what was to be blamed, Reagan maintained the Christian right's support and won re-election in 1984. So more specifically, in this paper, I'm going to develop a model of politics where politicians publicly propose policies, and then they privately choose whether to exert effort toward the proposal's success. Voters are going to observe a politician's policy proposal and the policy outcome, but not the politician's effort. And then they're going to decide whether to re-elect the politician. And just as a preview of the key findings that I'll present today, it will sometimes be optimal for a politician to feign, meaning they propose policies that voters want, but then privately exert little effort towards actually achieving these policies. The politicians that are most likely to engage in this feigning behavior are those that are less effective legislators and those who prefer the status quo. And then our model is going to provide some testable predictions. Under certain conditions, less effective legislators are going to publicly support policies that are closer to those what the voter demands. But privately, they might take actions in the opposite direction. And secondly, less effective legislators will be re-elected with a higher probability than more effective legislators. And so this second prediction is somewhat counterintuitive and non-standard in terms of existing models in pandering and accountability. And then I'm going to empirically test these predictions and find support for them. And I'm going to be looking at data from US House elections between 1990 and 2010.
Barton?
Mm-hmm.
Clarifying question, the fact that legislators are effective or not, is this public information? So do voters know what type of legislator you are, or is this private information?
Exactly. So I'll come back to that in the model, but it is going to be public. And the way I'm going to think about that empirically and also throughout the model is that you have an incumbent politician. I know your history of introducing and progressing bills through the legislative process. And from that, I can form expectations about your skill.
Okay, but this could be an endogenous sort of type, right? I can develop a reputation based on my own interest as a politician.
Yeah,
so taking that as given.
Yeah, I'm taking it as given for the sake of the model. In the empirical section, I will actually try to adjust that issue a little bit.
Yeah, okay, cool, thanks.
Okay, so as an outline of the talk, I'm going to present the benchmark model, and then I'm going to talk briefly about the related literature, and then go through theoretical results such as equilibrium comparative statics, and then I'll be focusing on the empirics, so I'll be generating predictions and then going through the data. So I'm going to present a slightly simplified model compared to what appears in the paper, but this will be sufficient for the talk. So there's just going to be a voter and an incumbent politician, and the timing is going to follow this timeline below. And I'm going to go through on the next few slides each of these stages. So I'll keep the timeline at the top of each slide. So in the first instance, politician's type is realized. They're either going to be a representative type, which is denoted by R with probability pi, or a strategic type with probability 1 minus pi, and we denote this by S. Types are privately known, but the distribution of types is common knowledge. Then the politician is going to choose an action. In fact, two actions. They're going to choose a policy proposal, P, which is public, and then they're going to choose an effort level in support of their proposal, which is either low or high, and this is going to be private. Now, depending on the politician's type, their action set might be restricted. And so if the politician is a representative type, meaning T equals R, then they're always going to propose a certain policy, theta R, and exert high effort level towards it. And I'll come back to the interpretation of this specific policy in a little bit, but we're going to think about this as the policy demanded by voters or the voters' ideal policy. On the other hand, the strategic politician is going to strategically choose these actions, and she's going to choose a policy proposal anywhere from the real line and privately choose an effort level, either low or high. The policy outcome is going to be stochastic and it's going to depend on both of these actions. And so we're going to denote the policy outcome by theta, and we're going to have a status quo policy denoted by theta naught, and we're going to put it at 0 without loss of generality. So the way that actions are going to map into policy outcomes is as follows. So if a politician exerts high effort level, then with some probability Q between 0 and 1, the proposal succeeds. And so the policy outcome is equal to the proposal. And with the remaining probability 1 minus Q, it fails and the status quo prevails. On the other hand, if they exert low effort level, then with probability 0, the proposal succeeds, or said otherwise, with probability 1, the proposal fails. So the status quo prevails. And so this parameter Q is the politician's legislative effectiveness. So conditional on exerting effort, how likely am I to actually achieve my policy proposal as the policy outcome? So two things I'm going to note here. One of them touches on JC's question that was already raised. So firstly, the voter observes the policy proposal and the policy outcome, so P and theta, but they're not going to observe effort. That's private action. The second key point is that legislative effectiveness is common knowledge. Okay, so the voter knows this, and the idea is that a voter can see a legislator's history of introducing bills and form beliefs about this. So moving on to the final part of the game, the voter has an action. They choose whether or not to, sorry.
Barton, sorry. So the probability that the policy succeeds is independent of the policy. That seems a smart assumption, right?
Yeah, so you could loosen that in an extension. For the sake of this model, it's just constant, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so the voter then chooses the decision of whether or not to elect the politician. And they're making this decision after observing a policy proposal, P, and a policy outcome, theta. And after this, the voter forms a belief about whether the politician is a representative type. So it's a posterior belief, mu P theta. And then they re-elect the politician with probability equal to their posterior belief. Okay, and so this is a simplification. The model in the paper is a little bit different. But implicitly, this is capturing a selection model where the voter just wants to elect a representative politician. But of course, we can microfound it in different ways and say, you know, actually the vote is policy motivated and they have ideal policy equal to theta R, which is this policy that the representative type always proposes, okay? So you could have either interpretation and have essentially the same model. So that's the timeline of actions. And then we just have to define preferences. And because I've simplified the model a bit and I have the representative politician and voters having fixed actions, there's no need to really talk about the utility functions. And so I'll just talk about the strategic politician. And this is actually the kind of main player that I'm going to be focusing on throughout the talk and also in the paper. So the strategic politician is both office motivated and policy motivated. They have an ideal policy, which we denote by theta S. And if they're re-elected, they get some benefit K. And so one utility function you could have in mind is that, you know, given a policy outcome theta, the utility is just a negative of the quadratic distance between their ideal point and the policy outcome, plus a benefit K if they're re-elected. And so this quadratic form is kind of easy to think about. You know, more generally, you can have any function that's continuous and decreasing the distance between the two policies. Okay, and then just the final part of the model is the equilibrium concept is perfect Bayesian equilibrium. And we just make one assumption on this re-election reward K. And we're just going to assume that's not too large. And this is just going to ensure that at least for some ranges of values that we're interested in, the policy motivations of the strategic politician will sometimes dominate the office motivations and sometimes vice versa. So this is going to give a richer set of behaviors that can emerge. Is there any questions on the model before I move on? Nope. Okay, so I'll just touch on the related literature before I present some results. And so there's lots of different ways you can think about how my model relates to some existing work in economics. One way to think about it is it's a model of signaling by this policy proposal. with an additional private action, which is effort. And of course, this maps into a policy outcome in a certain way. And one of the key parts of the model is that signaling in some sense is partially binding or acts as a partial commitment device. Meaning that if I make a policy proposal, I'm essentially committing myself to one of two policy outcomes. Either I achieve my policy or I fail and I maintain the status quo. And I can't then achieve some third policy. So it's committing me to just two outcomes. More specifically to the literature that I'm kind of working towards in politics and accountability, a key distinction of my model is that politicians have a limited ability to influence policy. So that comes up in this parameter Q, which was conditional on exerting effort. How likely am I to succeed in implementing my proposal? Okay, and so I was calling this legislative effectiveness. So in the extreme case where a politician has unlimited ability to influence policy, in some sense you can think about Q equal to 1 in this case, then my model is going to kind of reduce to something similar to the pandering and accountability models that we see in seminal papers like Maskin and Terrell and Keynes, Rowan, Heron, and Schultz. And the key takeaway from this literature is that a politician seeking re-election has an incentive to pander to voters where they just implement policies that voters want, even if they don't like that policy, or if that policy is in fact perhaps even bad for voters. Okay? So they might do this to get re-elected. By having limited accountability, I'm going to not only have that behavior, but I'm going to also have this story where politicians might optimally feign. So they might propose what voters want, but then privately actually try to make these policies fail by exerting low effort. In the other extreme, if politicians have no ability to influence policy, so Q equals 0, then we're kind of in this world of cheap talk models with reputation concerns. Okay. More broadly, my work connects with some literature, more applied literature. So thinking about political messaging and symbolic politics. So this captures the idea that politicians can benefit from supporting proposals, even if these proposals are doomed to fail. And in some sense, my contribution here is that I'm going to provide rational foundations for why, firstly, politicians might support policies that are doomed to fail. And secondly, why voters might actually view this as an informative signal and want to re-elect politicians that do this. The second literature links to is ambiguity in politics, so seminal works such as Alesina and Kuckerman. And this literature highlights that when seeking re-election, politicians might prefer less control over policy outcomes so that they can hide their preferences. My model is going to have a similar flavor to that come up in certain parts. And then the third literature that I want to touch on is a large political science literature that discusses the connection between skill, which can mean things like legislative effectiveness and so on, and its connection with electoral success and whether it's a positive relationship or not. So I'm not going to talk about that so much now because it's going to come up a few times in the talk, so I'll leave that for now. Okay, so now I'm going to go into the theoretical results. I'll start off with talking about re-election probabilities, and I'll characterize equilibrium behavior and go into some comparative statics. And then I'll go through the empirical section and of course, deriving some empirical predictions before that. So the first lemma I want to present is about re-election probabilities. And given that the model was a few slides ago, I think it's useful just to highlight two key parts of the model. So one of the key parts of the model was that a representative politician always proposes the policy that voters want, this theta R policy, and always exerts high effort. And the second key part is that given a policy proposal and policy outcome, a politician's re-election probability is simply given by the voters' posterior belief that the politician is a representative type. So the lemma has two parts. So the first is that if you're a politician and you propose any policy not equal to what the voter wants, then you're never going to be re-elected. Okay, and this is very straightforward because the voter knows that representative politicians always propose the policy that voters want. And so as soon as they see any other proposal, they know immediately that you can't be a representative politician, and so their posterior belief is 0. The second part of the lemma is a little bit more nuanced, and it says that if you do propose the policy that voters want, then no matter what the policy outcome is, whether you succeed in implementing it or you fail to deliver it, you're always going to be re-elected with positive probability. But furthermore, if you do succeed in implementing it, you're going to be re-elected with a weakly higher probability. And so the intuition is relatively straightforward here as well, because the voter knows that a representative politician always proposes this policy, but they also know that even though the representative politician exerts high effort level, sometimes they're going to fail. And so even when they see a policy failure, meaning the status quo prevails, there's going to be some probability that you are a representative politician. And so they're going to have some positive belief that you're actually a representative type, and they're going to re-elect you some of the time. But of course, if you do succeed in implementing it, that's going to be suggested that you exerted high effort level, which is in turn going to suggest that you're actually a representative type. So they're going to have a weakly higher posterior belief.
So just a quick clarification on 2. It only depends on your own type and effort. So do I get this right? In particular, it rules out situations where, for instance, I'm representative, but from a party which is just epsilon in minority, and I have plausible deniability that the other people have brought it down.
I'm not sure if I fully understand your question.
So let me try again.
Yeah.
This is only my own effort, and I am not taking into account when I set this inequality anything else but my own effort.
So this is the voter's posterior belief that you're a representative type.
Yeah.
And the policy outcome.
So their belief is only based on my effort and not on the composition of the parliament, if you want.
So they don't observe your effort, but they know your legislative effectiveness, which can depend on the composition of parliament and so on. Right? So if you're in a minority group, you may be unlikely to pass legislation, and so you're going to be a relatively ineffective legislator.
So I think I missed that part. Okay.
Alex, the 0 is the policy outcome.
Oh, okay. Okay.
It's not the effort. Right? You don't observe effort, you just observe policy outcome.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Simon.
Barton, just, when you introduced it, I thought this is innocuous, but now I wonder. So you say that you re-elect a politician with the probability equal to the belief that you think that he's representative. Is that right?
Yeah.
So if I think about a representative politician of being of some quality and the alternative of some other quality, then wouldn't I vote for the incumbent if that belief is above some threshold and not otherwise?
Yeah, so what you're getting at is maybe like how we would think about a challenger, and if the challenger is significantly more competent than the incumbent, for example. Does that get at kind of the setting you're thinking about?
Well, if I do not, there's an alternative, right? Whether that's challenger or whatever, there's a default option. If I don't have the incumbent, that must give me some value. There's some value associated with having a representative incumbent. There must be a difference between the two. And so then you would have some threshold rule and not just kind of a continuous probability of re-election.
Yeah, so the way I kind of provide more details in the paper about this is that there's a challenger, and their likelihood of having preferences aligned with you is uniformly distributed. And so we don't know ex ante what the likelihood the challenger is going to be that they're actually going to have the same preferences as me. And then once that's realized, I then choose whether or not to re-elect you, which is a threshold decision, but ex ante, it's actually this smooth linear increase. Okay, so if there's no more questions, I'll continue. So there's 2 key points that I want to highlight from this lemma. And the first is that we have this limited accountability story arises. So a politician who fails to deliver a policy is still going to be re-elected with positive probability. The second is that it highlights that whether or not a politician is re-elected might not depend kind of in a one-to-one way on the consequentialist perspective of what the policy outcome is. So it could be that a politician who proposed what voters want and fails, they're going to be re-elected with positive probability. But if I propose some other policy, then even though I achieve the same policy outcome, for example, I could be re-elected with probability 0. So I'm going to get re-elected at different rates depending on what I actually proposed, independent of the actual policy outcome. So an immediate implication of this lemma is that in equilibrium, just 3 behaviors are going to emerge. There can be mixing between these, but there's just going to be three kind of fundamental behaviors of the strategic politician. And these are that they're either going to be courageous, pandering, or feigning. And I'll describe what each of these behaviors are. And then on the next slide, I'll talk about the trade-offs between them and how this kind of maps into an equilibrium. So if the politician is courageous, they're going to be proposing their own ideal policy and exerting high effort level. If they're pandering, they're going to be proposing the policy demanded by voters and exerting high effort level. So they're actually genuinely trying to achieve it. And if they're feigning, they're going to be proposing what the voters want, but privately they exert low effort. In a sense, they inevitably force the policy to fail, even though publicly they were kind of promoting it. So to illustrate the trade-offs, I just want to keep in mind this following graph. So at 0, we have the status quo policy. At theta r, we have the policy demanded by voters. And somewhere in the middle, we're going to have this strategic politician's ideal point. And so the trade-off between these three behaviors is as follows. So if you're being courageous, that means you propose your own ideal policy and you use that high effort level towards it. But of course, this immediately reveals yourself not to be representative type. And so you're going to be re-elected with probability 0. So it maximizes the policy component of your payoff that minimizes your chances of re-election. On the other hand, if you're pandering, you're going to maximize your probability of re-election because you're going to perfectly mimic a representative type. You're going to pursue the policies that voters want, and you're actually going to exert high effort level towards them. And so you're going to maximize your chance of re-election, but there is going to be a policy cost, which is roughly equal to the distance between your ideal policy and the policy that voters want, or said otherwise, the policy you're actually exerting effort towards. But finally, if you engage in this feigning behavior, you're proposing what voters want, privately you exert low effort level, so you guarantee that this proposal actually fails. And so you're going to get intermediate re-election benefits and intermediate policy benefits. So you're going to get intermediate re-election benefits because the voter will be uncertain as to why the policy fails. They're still going to have some posteriori belief that you were a representative type that just got unlucky. And so there's going to be a non-zero re-election probability. But there's still going to be a policy cost because you ensure that the status quo prevails. And so it's going to be roughly equal to the distance between your ideal point and the status quo, which is at 0. And so as you can probably guess, as the strategic politician's ideal point varies, we're going to see a different equilibrium emerge. And so when your ideal point is close to what the voters want, you're going to have a strong incentive to pander because you're going to maximize your chance of re-election, and you're going to experience a small policy cost when your ideal points are close. On the other hand, if your ideal point is close to the status quo, then you're going to engage in feigning because you have a small policy cost of this and you're going to get re-elected with some probability. And if you're far away from both what the voters want and the status quo, then you're going to have an incentive to be courageous. So I won't present the formal characterization of the equilibrium, but I'll just provide the following kind of graph which illustrates the flavor of it. And indeed, it's kind of precisely that story on the last slide. So here we have a policy space from left to right as we vary the strategic politician's ideal point. At 0, we have the status quo. And at theta r, we have the policy demanded by voters. So when your ideal point is close to what the voters want, you pander with probability 1. When it's close to what the status quo is, you feign with probability 1. And when you're far from both, you're courageous with probability 1. Okay, and there are going to be some intermediate regions where you actually mix between these in a smooth fashion. So I'll just highlight some key takeaways from this characterization. So this result shows that when the preferences of politicians differ from those of voters, they need not be truthful. And in the language of my model, they need not be courageous. And in particular, we see that politicians might choose to pander, meaning they propose policies that voters want and actually exert effort towards achieving them. And this is very much in the same flavor as Maskin and Troll's paper. But because politicians have limited ability to influence policy, and in turn limited political accountability, they're going to have an additional incentive to engage in this feigning behavior, where they propose policies that voters want, exert low effort level in expectation and hope that the policy actually fails. And so this again highlights this idea that policy intentions and actions need not coincide, and whether you're re-elected or not need not depend precisely on policy outcomes. And one kind of quick comparative study you can see just from this characterization is that the politicians that are most likely to engage in this feigning behavior are the ones who have ideal policy close to the status quo. Okay, so those are the ones that are going to have the most incentive to feign because they're ensuring that the policy fails. More generally, we can ask, when is this feigning behavior more likely to occur with respect to other parameters in the model? And so the proposition I have here is that the strategic politician's probability of feigning is decreasing in her effectiveness, and it's increasing in their re-election reward. So before I provide the intuition, I just want to talk briefly about how this second dot point links to the existing literature. So this result runs contrary to some of the literature on electoral competition coming from Calvert and Whitman. And this literature overall suggests that stronger office motivations is going to incentivize politicians to behave better. And in turn, this will achieve policy outcomes closer to the median voter. So of course, I'm looking at a slightly different setting here, but my second dot point here suggests a kind of subtle difference on this result. Suggests that as your office motivations become stronger, strategic politicians are going to feign more often, which means that their public action is going to match what voters want. So they're going to appear to be closer aligned to the median voter, but privately, they're actually going to be exerting low effort level. And in some cases, you can construct examples where this will actually lead to a policy outcome further away from the median voter. Okay, so we're going to see that politicians appear to be better behaved, but in terms of outcomes, it need not be true. So let me talk through the intuition.
Barton, I have a quick question, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about like a legislative session or something, the period between two elections, there's usually, you know, a range of policies which, you know, a government puts forward. If I'm interpreting you correctly, as a watchful voter, I would see a difference in success based on, you know, how far a legislative goal was away from the a status quo. If I have a strategic politician, so if you have like a full agenda rather than an individual policy, as in your model, wouldn't there be more information for for voters to kind of deduce type from?
So that's a good question. So I think you're getting at the story of multi-dimensional policies and how you could maybe, you know, feign on one aspect and not on others. I haven't gone through that type of model and it looks quite difficult to go through, but I think you'd still see some similar effects. I'm not sure how to think about the compromise.
So I'm not necessarily thinking about, well, I guess it's analogous to multi-dimensional, but I'm thinking more about multi-item. So if you think about your Reagan example for the beginning,
mm-hmm.
He might have avoided certain, let's say, socially conservative policies, but there were a whole bunch of tax policies and so on, which he, let's say, pursued with a great deal more vigor.
Mm-hmm.
And so by looking at the difference with the, you know, even if you can't observe his effort, by observing, you know, relative success in the social versus economic realm, you might, you know, I think that's exactly what the historian's pointing out when, you know, drawing these conclusions about motivation.
Yeah, okay, I see. Yeah, that's a good point. So you would certainly learn more, and that'd be interesting to explore. My model doesn't account for that. In my model, the voter just cares about one issue. Perhaps that could be embedded in this Q term, but again, that's not going to be determined, you know, simultaneously at the same time. Does that address your question, more or less?
Somewhat. Maybe it's more of a direction for future research, something to think about.
Yeah, I think you're right. Thank you.
Barton,
mm-hmm.
wouldn't it be natural to think that different items have different cues? So, you know, as a Republican candidate, I'm going to have very easy a way to convince Congress to pass tax reforms that cut taxes to rich people, but I'm going to have a bit of a harder time to really force huge social reforms because, you know, there are going to be centrist Republicans from more coastal states that are going to oppose it. And so is it true that we can learn much about my effort in one item, looking at comparative results with outcomes in other items?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's a good point.
these things could be even the effort, or even my type, right? I could be a representative about taxes because I actually am a rich guy who wants no taxes, and I am a non-representative and strategic candidate in other social issues because I'm a Hollywood actor and I actually don't care about, abortion.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I think that's how I should think about it and frame it. Thank you. Okay, so I'll move on to the intuition for these two comparative statics. So the intuition is reasonably straightforward again. So we're just going to consider a special case where the strategic politician feigns with some probability between 0 and 1, perhaps including the end point of the interval, and is otherwise courageous. And this is actually going to be without loss of generality, where I'm not going to go through why for the talk. So if the politician engages in being courageous, then with some probability Q, they're going to be successful in implementing their ideal policy, and they're going to achieve maximum kind of policy utility. And with probability 1 minus Q, they're going to fail to deliver it, and they're going to maintain the status quo. So overall, their payoff is given by this term. On the other hand, if they feign, they're going to be proposing what voters want, exerting low effort level, they guarantee that the policy fails, so the status quo prevails. And sometimes they're going to get re-elected because the voter is going to be unsure about their type. And so the utility is going to be given by the distance between status quo and their ideal policy, plus some re-election benefit, which is equal to the voter's posterior belief that they're representative type, which is just given by Bayes' rule. So you can probably eyeball this and see that the net payoff is from feigning is decreasing in their effectiveness and increasing in the re-election reward. But there's actually, a reasonably nice intuition for why this is the case. So if you think about a politician who's being courageous, they're exerting effort towards their ideal policy and trying to achieve it. As they become more effective, they're going to be more likely to achieve the policies that they actually want. So their payoff is going to be increasing. On the other hand, if you're feigning, you always achieve the status quo policy, and your chances of getting re-election is given by the voters' posterior belief that you're representative. Now, this is decreasing your effectiveness for the following reason. If you imagine a politician who's been very effective at passing legislation, and then suddenly they propose a policy you want, but they fail to deliver it, you're going to be suspicious on whether they actually tried and whether they really have the same preferences as you. But as you become more successful, as you increase your effectiveness, I'm going to be even more suspicious because I'm going to expect policy failures to be even rarer. Okay, so my posterior belief is going to be decreasing as your effectiveness increases. And so we see that as effectiveness increases, not only does your payoff from feigning decrease, but your payoff from being courageous increases, and overall, you're going to be feigning with lower probability. Similarly, if you increase the re-election reward K, you can see it's not going to affect my payoff from being courageous because I'm foregoing re-election, but it's going to increase my payoff from feigning, and so in equilibrium, I'm going to feign with higher probability. And so an immediate corollary of this result is that the strategic politician's probability of re-election is decreasing in their effectiveness. And so an illustration of kind of an easy case is when the strategic politician feigns with probability 1 for all values of Q. Okay, so we can vary it Q and think about what does the re-election rate look like. And it's just going to be given by Bayes' rule and be this kind of natural concave curve. So the implications of this result with respect to the literature is that it connects to this body of work that I mentioned earlier about politicians' re-election chances and their skill. And so there's this large literature that tries to find this connection. Okay, and skill can be defined broadly to be things like competence, effectiveness, maybe positions within social networks within legislation. And overall, they find mixed empirical evidence of this relationship. And my contribution here is that I formalize precise conditions under which effectiveness is likely to have a negative effect on re-election. In particular, this is going to occur when politicians engage in this feigning behavior. And this occurs when some politicians prefer the status quo, but voters want some policy change which is far from the status quo. And I'll provide more details in the empirical section, but this condition is likely to be satisfied during trade shocks. Okay, and I'll provide a bit more discussion about that as I go along. So one additional result I want to talk about before the empirical section is about what is the effect of legislative effectiveness on payoffs more broadly. And the result I have here is essentially saying that, for different parameters of the model, anything can happen. So sometimes the strategic politician's equilibrium utility will be monotonically increasing in effectiveness, sometimes it'll be monotonically decreasing, and sometimes we'll actually have a non-monotonic effect, in particular be U-shaped. So the paper has a complete characterization of when we should expect each of these to occur, but I just want to provide intuition for this non-monotonicity result. So the intuition is as follows. So we know from earlier that as you become more effective, as we increase Q for a politician, the strategic politician is going to feign with weakly lower probability. And this can lead to, in some cases, a switching of equilibrium, meaning that for some low levels of effectiveness, they're going to feign with probability 1, but for higher levels of effectiveness, they're going to mix between being courageous and feigning. And it's this switching of equilibrium which is going to lead to this non-monotonicity. And that's because when you engage in this feigning behavior, your re-election probability is decreasing in effectiveness, and so your equilibrium utility is decreasing in effectiveness. But on the other hand, once you start to be courageous with positive probability, your utility is going to be increasing with your effectiveness because you're more likely to implement the policies that you actually want to achieve. And so maybe an illustration is the clearest way to see this. And so this is a numerical example of the strategic politician's equilibrium utility. And on the x-axis, we have legislative effectiveness. For low levels of effectiveness, they're feigning with probability 1, and so the equilibrium utility is essentially given by this voters' posterior belief. Okay, and it's decreasing as we increase Q. And at some point, they start to be courageous with positive probability, and then it starts to increase because now they just want to implement their ideal policy, and they're more likely to do that. So the implication of this result is that if we think about effectiveness being in part self-determined, and it's probably going to be something that moves slowly over time, one possible effect of voters and politicians having misaligned preferences and this feigning behavior is that different politicians are going to have different incentives to kind of increase or decrease their effectiveness. And so you can think about a relatively ineffective legislator, for example, and in this graph, they're going to have an incentive to reduce their own effectiveness. In other words, kind of increase the ambiguity in the policy outcome to hide their preferences. And so if we think about, maybe legislative environments, they might have an incentive to increase checks and balances. Whereas if you're a very effective legislator, you're going to have the reverse incentive. So of course, my model is a static model, but you could think about maybe speculate about what maybe the more dynamic consequence of this is. And it could be that your political bodies with relatively ineffective versus relatively effective legislators could have reverse incentives to increase or decrease their own effectiveness. And we could see kind of a further divergence over time. Okay? But again, that's only speculative because my model's static. Okay, so now I want to move on to the empirical predictions. So the focus of this paper is on this feigning behavior. And this emerges when voters want a certain policy change, theta R, which is in some sense far from the status quo. But some portion of politicians, namely the strategic type, prefer to maintain the status quo. So their ideal point is close to theta naught. But in practice, this is in some sense unlikely to be the case. So the status quo is probably going to be endogenous, meaning it's close to what the voters want. And via electoral selection, we expect the politicians are likely to reflect the preferences of the median voter, okay, at least in their observed behavior. And so a question is, when is this feigning behavior likely to be of empirical relevance? And I'm going to argue that trade shocks is going to provide a nice setting to think about this feigning behavior emerging. And this is because I'm going to conceptualize trade shocks as in the following way. So we let the policy space correspond to, say, foreign trade in the US federal government. And absent a trade shock, there's going to be little disagreement between what the strategic politician wants, what the voter wants, and the status quo. And the effect of a trade shock is that it's going to cause voters' ideal policies to shift towards the protectionist direction. So visually, we can think about the policy space. Status quo policy and the strategic politician and voters' ideal points being close together. But the effect of a trade shock is going to cause voters to demand a more protectionist policy. Okay. And at the same time, some portion of politicians are still going to try to maintain the status quo. So you might want to think about these as being establishment politicians. And so the specific empirical setting that I'm going to be looking at is US House elections between 1990 and 2010 and trade shocks from Chinese imports. And I'm going to be using, this setting has been studied by Order, Dawn and Hansen's 2013 paper. And specifically in this setting, Feigning and Hall show that in districts affected by large shocks, we indeed see that voters' preferences shift towards protectionism, which is one of the key assumptions from the last slide. But furthermore, we actually know what the policy outcome is. Okay, and this is going to be important for the predictions. We know that over this time period, protectionist proposals largely failed. And so there's industry papers that talk about this phenomenon. But you can also just look at codings of bills given by certain think tanks. And they show that free trade bills are much more likely to pass than protectionist bills during this time period. So in this setting, and with some extra work, we can attain the following predictions. And I'm not going to provide the full details for them, but I'll provide a little bit of intuition. So the predictions are that in districts affected by trade shocks, less effective legislators are more likely to propose protectionist bills. And secondly, less effective legislators will be re-elected with higher probability. And so the intuition for these is similar to the previous comparative statics. So as you become more effective, you're less likely to engage in this feigning behavior. And so you're less likely to propose what the voters want. Okay, so that's the first prediction. The second one is, again, if you're feigning, you maintain the status quo, and that was the policy outcome in this empirical setting. And so voters are going to have are going to be more and more suspicious that you're actually pursuing their preferences when you do not achieve it, okay? And they're going to be more suspicious and more effective you are.
So Barton, sorry to interrupt again, but that kind of identifying assumption is that the trade shock affects the voters' preferences, but not the legislators. Could you say a little bit more why this is a sensible assumption? I don't see why should legislators care at all about trade policies?
So I'm not assuming that all politicians try to maintain the status quo, just some portion, okay? And this could be a small portion, right? So the assumption here is that you always have two types of politicians, some that just do what voters want, and some that might have their own policy motivations. And this could be a small portion. And the reason why this small portion might prefer to maintain the status quo is maybe they just don't like change, maybe they're establishment politicians, maybe they've made costly investments in the existing policy, okay? Or maybe they have financial reasons with respect to lobbyists why they might want to maintain free trade stance.
Okay, so
it's only that some portion of politicians might prefer the status quo.
So I think of the things that you mentioned, the kind of vested interest, or you got somebody who invested into your seat, and you owe them something. Mm-hmm. So that strikes me as that's the most convincing.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so one thing I really want to emphasize is that this is not a direct test of feigning, and that's because, of course, we can't see effort. Okay, so I'm just testing implications of my model. And one thing to note is that prediction 2 is a non-standard prediction that doesn't follow from standard models of politics and accountability. Okay. So again, the key assumptions that link the model to the predictions is that in districts affected by exogenous trade shock, voters will demand relatively more protectionist policies, and there's a large literature to show that this indeed happens, or at least suggests that it happens. Some politicians will simply demand to pursue the demands of the voter, and some other politicians will try to maintain the status quo. And overall, during this period, protectionist policies largely failed. And then, of course, there's some common knowledge assumptions which are embedded in the model, which is that voters observe policy proposals, the politician's effectiveness, and the policy outcome, but do not observe the effort or the politician's type. Okay, so this brings me to the empirical section, and I'm going to go through the data. The main specification, I'm going to be using an instrumental variable, so I'll talk briefly about the validity of the instrument exclusion restriction and then present some results. So as an overview, I'm going to be focusing on US House elections, and I'm going to identify districts affected by trade shocks using exposure to Chinese imports. And I'm going to capture supply side shocks using instrumental variable of order Dawn and Hanson's, and specifically Feigenbaum-Hall's data, where they put that same data set into congressional districts. And I'm going to be measuring a politician's effectiveness via their legislative effectiveness score, LES, which was developed by Craig Volden and Alan Wiseman in 2014. And loosely speaking, it captures a legislator's history of introducing and progressing bills into law. In a bit more detail, I'm going to measure a district's trade shock by their trade exposure to Chinese imports. And this is just going to be a weighted sum of Chinese goods imported into the US by industry, weighted by the fraction of a district's workers in that industry during that time period. And the instrumental variable is going to be a similar weighted sum, but we're going to be looking at Chinese goods that were imported into other high-income countries. Okay, and we're also going to be looking at the proportion of a district's workers in a certain industry from the previous time period. Okay, so this is going to allow us to avoid issues of demand and focus on supply-side shocks. So one of the key variables in this analysis is a politician's legislative effectiveness, or their LES score. And as I mentioned, this is a legislator's history of introducing and progressing bills. And I'm not going to go through the full details of it, but essentially it's an average of 5 terms. And each of these terms is a legislator's kind of performance within a certain category of legislative ability. So the first one is bill, which is the number of bills a legislator introduces, normalized for that Congress, and also taking into account the significance of the bills they introduce. Okay, so they're not going to, if they introduce mainly commemorative bills, it's not going to be as important as introducing substantive or significant bills. And this coding is done by Bolden and Wiseman. These 4 other terms are very similar, but rather than just looking at bill introductions, they're looking at how far you got your bill through the legislative process. So the second term is AIC, which is how many bills did you introduce that actually had action in the committee, okay? The second one is bills that you introduced that had an action beyond the committee. The fourth term is bills that you introduced that passed the House. And the 5th term is bills that you introduced that actually became law. Okay, so as you can see, this is a sum that's trying to capture a legislator's ability to not just introduce legislation, but also pass it throughout the legislative process. So one limitation which I come across for prediction 1 is that policy proposals in our context, trade bill introductions are very rare. And so instead I'm going to use as a proxy roll call voting behavior on trade bills. And the idea is that roll call voting behavior is public, like policy proposals, and it affects a politician's re-election probability. And so there's empirical studies to show that that's the case. And importantly, it does not reveal a politician's effort, so it's going to be vulnerable to feigning in a similar way. And so throughout the analysis, the dependent variable for prediction 1 is going to be trade score, which is a measure of a legislator's likelihood to cast a roll call vote in the protectionist direction. And finally, the time period in sample. I'm going to split the time period into 2 decades, 1993 to 2000 and 2003 to 2010. And the idea is that there's a small number of trade bills, so even though we're looking at roll call voting, we want to get a bit more data points. But we also want to maintain our analysis to be within a single redistricting period. And this time split is similar to the order Dawn and Hanson's paper and also Feigenbaum-Hall's. And the main sample I focus on is going to be legislators that continually sought re-election and served no more than 5 terms. And I have robustness checks that show that the results aren't driven by this assumption, but it's just going to avoid issues of strategic exit and focus our sample on legislators where their in-office performance is likely to be more salient to their re-election chances. So for both predictions, I'm going to be looking at the same regression, but changing the dependent variable. And so we're going to have a constant term. We're going to have an interaction between this legislative effectiveness score and the trade shock, and then singular terms for the trade shock effectiveness and the controls. And so for prediction 1, the dependent variable is trade score, meaning the likelihood you are to vote in the protectionist direction. And the prediction here is that this interaction term is going to have a negative coefficient, meaning that conditional on a shock, as you become more effective, you're less likely to vote in the protectionist direction. And for prediction 2, we're looking at whether or not you're re-elected and maintain power. And again, we expect that the interaction term will have a negative coefficient, meaning that conditional on shock, if you're more effective, you're less likely to be re-elected. So one point that will come up when I look at the empirical results is that the way we're going to kind of think about the empirical effects of, say, a trade shock and effectiveness is that we're going to not only consider this beta-1 term, but also this beta-3 term. And so specifically, we're going to be looking at, say, do a thought experiment where we have a median level trade shock and we reduce a legislator's effectiveness by 1 standard deviation. And so because of that, we're going to be thinking about both this beta-1 and beta-3 term. Okay, so just before I can present the analysis, I need to talk about the instrumental variable and its validity, okay, because I'm using that to capture supply side shock, trade shocks. So of course, these variables are used in a large number of works, and so it has a strong first stage. And the exclusion restriction in my context is that Chinese imports to other high income countries do not have a direct effect on an incumbent's roll call voting behavior or a voter's voting decision, except through its effect on district import exposure. So Order, Dawn, and Hansen's paper studies this, uses this variable and shows this exclusion restriction holds when the dependent variable has to do with local economic conditions. In my context, I'm looking at the political dimensions. And in fact, both these trade shock variables and in fact also my dependent variables are exactly the same as Fagan-Borman-Hall's. Okay, so there's similar discussions which we're both going to have in our papers. So just on the political dimension, if you think incumbent and voter behavior is driven purely by local economic conditions, then Order, Dawn, and Hansen's arguments are going to apply in a similar way. But of course, there could be politics-specific concerns. So maybe there's lobbying. So one story you might create is that Chinese imports in overseas markets could influence voter and incumbents if some interest groups have stakes in overseas markets. These groups lobby Congress members and voters to vote in their preferred direction so that they can attain better outcomes. But my claim is that this is unlikely to be a serious issue because firstly, individual legislators have reasonably little ability to influence policy domestically, let alone to influence policy that's going to then influence overseas markets. Okay, so it's kind of impossible to rule out this effect, but it's something which we don't suspect to be a serious issue. Okay, so now I'll present the results. So for prediction 1, this is when we're looking at the dependent variable is a legislator's likelihood to vote in the protectionist direction. And I'll just draw your attention to column 6 and 7, where we've got this full regression with the interaction term. Column 6 is the OLS specification, and column 7 is the IV. And our prediction was that this interaction term would have a negative coefficient. And indeed, we see that there's a negative coefficient and it's statistically significant, meaning that conditional on a shock, as you become more effective, you're less likely to vote in the protectionist direction. But the thought experiment which we can do is think about a median level trade shock, so 1.8, and consider a legislator that's 1 standard deviation less effective, and ask, well, what does that affect on their voting behavior, on their roll call voting behavior? The OLS specification suggests they're going to be 1.97 percentage points more likely to vote in the protectionist direction, and in the IV, 1.86 percentage points more likely to vote in the protectionist direction. Okay, so this is in line with our first prediction. The second prediction is when we have as a dependent variable whether or not you were elected or maintain power. And so again, this is the same format as the last table. Column 6 and 7 is this full regression model with the interaction terms. And column 6 is the OLS and column 7 is the IV. So again, our prediction was that there would be a negative coefficient on this interaction term, meaning conditional on a trade shock. As you become more effective, you're less likely to be re-elected. And indeed, we see that there's a negative coefficient and it's statistically significant. So again, we can do this thought experiment with a median level trade shock and a 1 standard deviation decrease in effectiveness. And the OLS is going to say that you're re-elected with 2.91 percentage points more often. And in the IV, it's 3.73 percentage points. So again, this is in line with the predictions. One thing I want to note before I move on, and I'll come back to towards the end, is that absent a trade shock, so if the trade shock term delta IPW is close to 0, there's actually a really strong and positive effect of LES or legislative effectiveness on your re-election probability. And indeed, this is kind of what you might have intuitively expected, that more effective politicians are desired, so they should be re-elected more often. my empirical results are showing actually, absent a trade shock, during these kind of normal times in quotes, that is the case. But when there's a trade shock, this effect can be reversed. And my model is suggesting that that's coming from this feigning story, okay? Even though we can't directly test for feigning. Okay, so we can show that my results are broadly robust to different specifications. But in the interest of time, I'm going to not go through all of those. And I'll just talk about two kind of more broader concerns you might have with some of the analysis. And the first point touches on JC's question about, maybe this legislative effectiveness score, the way I described, you might want to think about it, could be endogenous to effort. So the issue which JC brought up is that it could depend on effort, this LES term, whereas Q in my model is exogenous and in some sense is a legislator's immutable kind of intrinsic ability to pass legislation. So the issue is that it could be that politicians that are actually very ineffective in the language of my model introduce bills more often and just try to get stuff done more often. And because of that, they end up with a very high LES score because we're just empirically measuring this. Whereas it could be that politicians who are actually very effective in my model do the reverse. And you could see a switching of LES and what I'm talking about effectiveness in my model. So overall, it's unlikely that there actually exists a perfect measure that's going to perfectly address JC's concerns. But there are some alternative measures that we can look at, which are going to be slightly less affected by this effort story. So one measure you could look at is age, just simply how old a legislator is, seniority, the number of continuous terms they've served, or a third one, which is betweenness measure, which is your position within a co-sponsorship network and looking at kind of how central are you to the social network of politicians. And of course, we probably expect that this betweenness measure is going to be a more precise measure of what we mean by effectiveness, and seniority is going to be a bit noisier and age probably the noisiest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present the analysis where rather than using that LES term, I instead use age, seniority, and betweenness. Okay, so this table has these three measures being used, and in column 1 and 2 are the OLS and IV, and same for 3, 4, 5, 6. And so this is for prediction 1, where the dependent variable is your likelihood to vary the protection's direction. And as you can see in all cases, this interaction term has a negative coefficient. And in the case of seniority and this betweenness measure, meaning your position within the co-sponsorship network, it's statistically significant. Again, you can do this with our other prediction 2, where we have the re-election as the dependent variable. And again, we have a similar story. So using age, this interaction term, we have essentially a 0 effect. But using seniority or betweenness, we have the negative coefficient and statistically significant. So again, in line with what we expected. So this kind of exercise gives us 2 takeaways. The first is that it gives us a little bit more confidence that this LES measure isn't just being driven by effort. And perhaps we can discuss more after the talk. And the second one is it gives us a bit more confidence that this LES measure isn't just capturing some kind of specific or idiosyncratic feature of how they collect data on legislators introducing bill. So we're detecting something which kind of extends to broader measures of effectiveness. The final concern I want to maybe address is about ideology. So one question which could come up is, can these results simply be explained by ideological extremism? And this is particularly of note because there was a recent AER paper just published, I think this month, by Order, Dawn, Hansen, and Marcellesi, that showed that trade shocks created demand for more extreme legislators, so that in districts affected by large trade shocks, moderate, both Republicans or Democrats, were thrown out and replaced with more extreme legislators of the same party. And so you could create a story where ideologic extreme legislators face greater legislative barriers, and this leads them to have a lower LES score. And in addition, voters just demand more extreme legislators because of trade shocks. In which case, our story of effectiveness and feigning is, might not be the right explanation. So as a little bit of a spoiler, I'll just say empirically, there's some papers that show that by Clark, Vold, and Wiseman, that there's actually no connection between this LES measure and a politician's legislative effectiveness, even though this story is very intuitive. And within my sample, I also see there's no obvious relationship. But what I can do in addition is to rerun my analysis where I include a measure of ideological extremism and see if whether this changes my results. So column 3 and 4, I'm looking at the dependent variable here is whether or not you're re-elected. And again, I have the full regression, but in addition, I have a measure of ideological extremism, which is your distance to, absolute distance to the sample median with respect to DW nominate. And I'm including the interaction term with trade shock and also singular term. And in column 4, at least, we see that there's still a negative coefficient on this interaction term and it's statistically significant and of a similar magnitude as the main results. And so this gives us a bit more confidence that our results aren't being driven by this ideology story. So second last slide before I wrap up. My results have some broader empirical implications for the political science literature. And so, as I mentioned a few times, there's this broad literature that asks, what is the effect of skill, broadly defined, on a politician's re-election rate? And some papers, such as Miguel and Snyder and Mondak, show there's a positive relationship, and others find there's a negative relationship. So my theoretical and empirical results provide a possible explanation that there's actually this non-monotonic effect. And it provides a story about how we should think about this. And that's when politician and voter preferences differ, it may actually have a negative effect because politicians engage in this feigning behavior. And then as a politician is more effective, voters are going to be more uncertain as to whether or not they're the type of politician they want to re-elect. Whereas when the voters and politician preferences are aligned, we actually find empirically a strong positive relationship. And so overall, this suggests that future research could benefit from including controls that capture the differences in strategic environments that politicians behave in, not just politicians' individual attributes. So I'll just conclude with a few dot points summarizing the talk. So the starting point of this project was that politicians have limited ability to influence policy. And this leads them to have an incentive to feign, meaning they propose policies that voters want, exert low effort level in the expectation and hope that these policies fail, and knowing that they're not going to be held fully accountable. And this feigning behavior is more likely to occur when a politician is less effective or when they just prefer the status quo. And then we derived some empirical predictions and tested these and found support for them. In particular, for a median level trade shock, a 1 standard deviation decrease in effectiveness is going to lead to legislative support protections policies more often and to be re-elected more often. And these are robust to various specifications, looking at alternative measures of legislative effectiveness, and they're not driven by this ideological extremism story. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right, thank you. If there's any questions, just unmute yourself and shoot. Well, if there are not any questions, let's give Barton a round of applause then. So, real or virtual ones. Thank you so much, Barton. It's been a wonderful talk. And thank you everyone for coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much.